I think that's where the AR plays a part. Like, in order to build a new future, we need to be able to imagine it. In order to be able to imagine it, we need to be able to see what's possible.
Idris, thank you for being on Urgent Futures.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to get into a lot of your work across augmented reality, but to start, I wanted to begin with questions around monuments. In 2017, you led a campaign to have the statue of Christopher Columbus removed from Columbia Circle. Can you tell me a little bit about what was animating that and why you believed that was something important?
Yeah, so me and my collective were unhappy, I would say, to say the least, with how our public spaces were represented. I think Columbus and Columbus Circle just represented an example of what was going on nationwide. I think we were reckoning with our history, reckoning with who tells that history and how that history shows up in our everyday lives, who we value, who we remember. Out of like the 200 plus monuments that have been removed in the entirety of the United States, like over 75% of them, I think the number is even higher, were since 2017. And so I think it's clear that there's a movement now to, again, reckon with that history and then think about what we want to do with that history. And I think in place of this oppressive history. And I think that's where the imagination, the arts come into play, is imagining what that new space looks like. And so the New York City, even though it's one of the most diverse cities on the planet, the public spaces don't tell that story. We have statues of people like Christopher Columbus, and we don't have many statues and public sentiments and public like markers that showcase the history of the Black and brown queer communities that exist and built the city. And so I think it's important for us to use that moment of Christopher Columbus when the city and Mayor de Blasio were figuring out what to do about this statue to make our voices heard, make our communities' voices heard, and find a new way to energize our communities, as well as show people the real truth, the real history. And I think that's where the augmented reality came into play. And so, yeah, I think that's really, we took that moment to showcase what new can exist within these spaces, as well as educate folks on why these statues are coming down, why there are a lot of people advocating for these removals.
And how does augmented reality intersect with ideas of monuments in this way? You hinted at this a little bit, but I think a lot of people think of Pokemon Go when they think of augmented reality. And what's really exciting about your work is you're bringing this social impact angle and this idea of not simply resurrecting histories, but actually foregrounding histories that have been erased.
Yeah, I mean, place-based activations, creative placemaking, however you want to make the term, has existed forever. Public art has always been a thing. Monuments have been a thing. Monuments are ways to, I think what I always say is monuments represent what values our society has as a collective, not individually, but what our society is choosing to showcase. That's what I think the message, the subconscious messages that we're receiving about our history, our values, is through our monuments. And up until like 2016, when Pokemon Go was released, that was extremely physical. And the technology existed, but not on a mass scale, like Pokemon Go showed the potential of this technology. So I think what we're doing is not new in terms of like the idea. It's putting our stories and our histories out there in public space. But I think what AR does is it democratizes that process. A lot of the times when monuments are being decided on, or public art even is being decided on, That goes through a committee, a selection committee that goes through government officials. There's a lot of bureaucracy and red tape. And at each of those stages, like, voices are silenced, whether we like it or not. And so how can we open up the avenues for our communities and the public to participate in our public spaces, to reimagine our public spaces, to make it feel like it's their own? I think a lot of the studies show that if community public-based art is activated within a space, that it makes residents happier. It makes residents more involved in their cities and in their spaces. But I think that's exactly the issue. Residents feel disconnected from our public, especially with COVID. And I think Pokemon Go was the inspiration for us. I played it. A lot of my team still plays it still to this day. And that said, whoa, like, I can go catch my Charizards wherever, and it's based on a specific location. Like, this provides a whole new avenue and medium to affect and change our public. Social justice organizations, nonprofits, and just storytellers in general and artists have always been trying to figure out a way to activate these spaces for the public. And I think AR provides a new way to do that. And so for us, it was like, okay, we have these stories, we have these 3D monuments, we have proposals for monuments we want to see exist in the city. With AR, why don't we just do that? And so in the beginning, we didn't build out this whole Pokemon Go system because we didn't have the money, but two, it was fairly new. And so we just I was building the prototypes that we would take out in a public space, hand people our iPads because it was custom builds, like nothing was on the App Store. We brought canvases so people could do image-based recognition. And we also had surface detection for people to be able to place monuments at Columbus Circle and honestly anywhere around the city. I think for the first few years, we were lugging canvases around in bags and going to wherever we could to really showcase what this could do. And I think that's where the AR plays a part. Like, in order to build a new future, we need to be able to imagine it. In order to be able to imagine it, we need to be able to see what's possible. And I think AR allows not only a certain few to show what's possible, but it allows a lot of people to have that option and have that possibility. And so I think that's the road and the mission that we're on, is how can we empower ourselves and our communities to celebrate, preserve history, create monuments, and activate our spaces with their stories.
It dovetails with something that you said in an interview about history. You said people always say history is boring, but that's also if we think about it from a white Eurocentric perspective of written history. What about the dynamic ways in which Black and Brown folks have captured history? How are you thinking about translating those non-Eurocentric modes of recording history through AR and engaging folks in the present as you're describing?
History has always been written by the winners. And what's actually goes even further is that they've actually oppressed and made illegal for folks of color during slavery to even learn how to read and write. But even beyond that, going back to ancient Africa, I think storytelling and the ways in which we have passed down history through orally is one way, is a way that perfectly matches with today in technology. We're being able to record audio. People do voice memos or more robust oral history programs. So I think that's one way, is how can we orally capture folks' stories on the ground. But two is, dance, art, music. Those have also been ways in which we have recorded our stories, in which we have passed that down. Movement, even dances today that you're seeing on TikTok stem from long histories of dance throughout the U.S., Africa, and just throughout the world. And there's always that present between the past and the future. And I think a part of Kinfolk's job is to shine a light on that connection. The Colin Kaepernicks of the world come from a long line of activists that have done public stands, of Muhammad Ali and Jackie Robinson, and before that, the dances. There's a long line of folks who have done that, and that's, I think, what we're doing. And with AR and just XR in general, there's a way that we can more readily capture that kind of media, whether that's volumetric capture, to capture performances, and bring that into a space where that can be shared with everyone. Whether that's animated media, 3D models that can really humanize and bring our stories to life as if you're there in the room with people. I think spatial information is pretty key to understanding a lot of history. And so that's why I think AR really opens up a whole new way that makes history more dynamic. And sound is one of the last things that I'll mention, but even in like immersing yourself in a sound bath of the times, which we did with the Tribeca piece that we had, I think that can also transport you back. And I think the AR allows us to also transport back, but also bring the history to you in the present. So there's a time travel aspect of this that I think is pretty interesting. And so, yeah, I mean, AR, XR, all of these tools really allow for more dynamic capturing and of history and of people and of lived experience, but also storytelling and the accessibility to bring that to anyone everywhere.
Mm. It seems like it creates, if it works, a virtuous circle where not only are you foregrounding these alternative modes of history relative to the Eurocentric norm, but you're also then allowing young people who are using what many people see as a very futuristic technology to engage with those ideas before some of those, again, normative Eurocentric ideas of history have kind of cemented into their minds.
That's a good point. I think that's a really good point, in terms of like not allowing our minds to get overloaded and like sort of bogged down by the traditional way of doing things. And if a student is able to engage with these modes extremely early on, I think it allows them to be more curious moving forward, to be more critical, and just opens their mind just on a personal level on what they can do moving forward. I think a lot of times I'm speaking to people about what I do, and kids are like, wow, wait, I can do that? Like that's a way. Like I was into history, but I'm also into art. I'm also into painting. Like this is a way that there's other modes of living life and working, that I think this is what I've seen in terms of like empowering kids with these tools and this technology. So that's another point that just sparked my mind, but that was a good point that you brought up.
I love that. I mean, speaking of young people, engaging with new technologies, let's rewind a little bit and tell me about your formative experiences that led you to ultimately be somebody working in this, weird nexus of art and technology.
Yeah. So I've come from a family of storytellers. Both of my parents are filmmakers. And so that was documentary filmmakers at that. So I think that started my journey off pretty young of being critical and thinking about the world and valuing art, and storytelling as just valuing that in general. And then I went to a private school called Dalton in New York City from like kindergarten to 12th grade. And within that experience, I mean, it was a great education, but it was also an environment that wasn't necessarily built for people like myself, for Black folks. And so there was a sense of otherness, and a sense of a sense of need and a sense of like a drive on my end to fix what I experienced, in terms of not learning about the breadth of my history, and also not knowing the tools that I can work with moving forward. And so it was important. That really set the stage for, like, I guess my mission as an artist, or my practice, is investigating these archives and finding new ways to bring it to life for storytelling. But honestly, when I was going to college, I wanted to be a doctor, which I'm thinking back, I was like, well, I was tweaking. Like, I don't know why I wanted to be a doctor. That didn't fit with who I am. But I took one zoology class in freshman year, and I was like, I'm done. Like, this is not for me. But I ended up picking up cognitive science, and computer science. That was my major and minor. And I think I was big on thinking about emotions, and how the computer affects those emotions,
Mm.
computer interfaces, human computer interfaces. And so I was doing UX, doing UI, but I think more intently, this was like 2013. I was like, VR was coming up. It was not really publicly released. We were on the Oculus DK2 at that time. And I was like, I'm really interested in what this does and what putting folks within that environment, whether that's a scary environment, whether it's a joyous environment, what that does cognitively to the brain. And so I applied for a grant to buy a DK2 with a computer. I got the grant. And so I was able to start playing around with it before the general public did. And I mean, as a person with this VR headset in the college, like I've just, I put a bunch of people through this thing, whether it was for research or at a party. So it was super fun to be able to engage with folks. And truly, like the amount of times I've seen people's minds blown from this is wild. And then I mean, that's what I did end up doing my work in college on and think about that further. But at my core, I was always an artist, doing visual art, graphic design, making music, painting. And so when I left college, I was looking to work at a job full time doing software engineering. But I think I wanted something a little bit more creative. Artistically creative, I should say. And there was the path in my life in another multiverse where I was going and working a corporate job, building internal tools or something like that. But I think this path I got taken on a different path. And so I actually did end up going to work at Google. My mentor, Errol King, started this program called Code Next, where we taught Black, Brown, Asian high schoolers around New York City how to do computer science. And so we brought them over to the lab at Google. It was a makerspace in Chelsea. And we had after school programs where we taught them things like processing, video game making, engineering, like physical engineering, UX, UI, app design. There was a bunch of different programs. Leadership, emotional intelligence and leadership was also something that we taught. And then there was a Saturday all day 9 to 5 core class where we brought the quote unquote advanced students. And so that was like a really empowering position to be in, which was really teaching the kids, empowering the kids and exposing them to what the future is. Like they would 3D model, and then we'd put just 3D models in Snapchat Lens and look at them on the wall. And I think really going through the process of learning AR, VR with them, the amount of times we spent just playing VR games, I think that was also empowering for them to get a sense of what they were doing. And this was like starting in middle school, going through 10th grade, like 7th to 10th grade. So that was a part of that was my start, I would say. But then on the side in 2017, this monuments conversation started to take off. And I was like, all right, well, I need a side project besides some of my artwork. And I connected with a few friends and we started to build. I was doing the prototyping and we started to prototype this app. Like, what if we could tell the true story of Christopher Columbus? And then from there, that sort of spiraled into what it is now. So that's sort of TLDR, sort of my path into what was born as Kinfolk.
I want to get to Kinfolk, but you brought up a bunch of things that I want to go a little deeper on. The first is, what do you feel like you learned in teaching young people? Like what you're describing seems like you would learn a lot about how people relate to immersive technologies, what habits or tendencies people have. So I'm just curious, like, do you feel like there were any important lessons you learned in the course of teaching young people that you would then later bring into Kinfolk?
I mean, one, the kids taught me how to be a professional. Like they, if I didn't come prepared, they would call me out immediately. If I was, so I think that's number one. I think kids are harsh, and I learned that immediately. But I think to answer your question, what I really learned was, I mean, being transparent, I think, with what you're building, with the people that you're building it with is super important. Um, Through teaching them, I also, like, one of their projects was to develop a community-based project that they could design a solution around, like technology solution around. And I was showing them the process of what I was building at Kinfolk at the same time. And I mean, the ideas that they had, like, I think some executive director CEOs might not think that like a student that's in like an eighth grade can have that would take an idea from an eighth grader seriously, but they were providing ideas and perspectives that I think were really valuable to what we were building at the time. And I think that's something that we're trying to build with Kinfolk moving. How can we, as transparently as possible, build with community? There's a avenue where we can build something and just provide it and then tweak it. But I think what are the foundational ways in which our communities can get involved in the progression of a platform, of a technology space? How can they feel ownership over that technology space? And I also learned that, I mean, like, while to myself and maybe yourself, like AR, VR, that's something that is second nature. We get a AR app, even if it's a new one, we know the language, we know the movements, how to engage, but it took a lot of time for kids to understand that. Some kids got it faster than others, but some kids, it took them a long time. And so I think, as important as it's been to build this out and give it to people, since our audience with Kinfolk isn't just like tech literate folks, there is an empowerment angle and an educational angle that and like an physical onboarding angle. Like, how can we make it as easy as possible for people to understand this new mode of technology? I think a lot of people have, kids less so, but a lot of people in general have, with no fault of their own, myself included, have a prescriptive way of using technology, that a 2D based way. Whereas a 3D way is definitely more intuitive, because that's how we engage with the world. In my opinion, it is a very large break from our reality in terms of technology. So there was a lot of onboarding I had to do with the kids, and that's really stuck moving forward. That's super important.
I want to pick up on that idea of 3D literacy that you're talking about, how it's actually more intuitive, but we've been so distanced from it through the course of several decades of abstracted 2D interfaces. How are you thinking about that in terms of what you're building with Kinfolk? And I guess this is a good moment to kind of like give the one-liner on Kinfolk and share a little bit about what Kinfolk is.
Yeah. I mean, Kinfolk is an augmented reality archive. We create 3D monuments and house archival materials from the community that can be placed within public spaces, but that can also be engaged with wherever you are. And so for us, it's about historical preservation, but through the arts and through community. We co-create these digital monuments with members of communities that we're a part of, that we where there's direct advocacy going on through, like, maybe it's land backs, maybe it's reparations, critical race theory monuments. There's a bunch of movements that have storytelling and history at its core. And so I think that's the spaces that you'll find us in. And so it's basically, we're trying to figure out how to create a platform that is centering Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer histories. And yeah, so that's what Kinfolk is. And what was the second part of your question?
Just you're thinking about 3D as an intuitive interface versus 2D.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's something that we struggle with, right? Like, it's when we're building this out, my vision is this is a tool that can help us more critically engage with our public, whether that's coming across these layers of new monuments that are existing in spaces that they wouldn't, if that's going to existing monuments, bringing out your phone and digital context is popping up, or AR graffiti pops up. I think these are things that are in our mind to give the people a sense of control and a sense of empowerment over their spaces. But I think a question that keeps popping up is, will people understand how we use it? We've been trying to get a tendency for our team to not simply build the most innovative and flashy thing, when sometimes folks will struggle to even get to that point. A lot of the folks maybe still sometimes struggle to find how to place a monument, twist a monument. Editing a 3D object in your space is something that comes very easy to me and to our team and to XR enthusiasts in general. But when we're in a classroom with teachers who need to learn how to instruct their kids, that's something that's not so intuitive, and there needs to be really direct. We have to think about that problem directly and come up with solutions for it. So I think there's a lot of features and ideas that I think needs to have a lot of user testing, even before it even gets to the building phase, like concept, like storyboards, like, does this make sense to you? I think that's a lot of what our team has had to invest and will continue to invest more time in. So I think that's our solution to the problem. But I think that's why I always say, like, yeah, damn, like, I'm 10 years a little too early, which I've been using 10 years for the last 5 years to say that. So I don't know when we reach that point, but it is really, we're really early adopters. And so a part of it is us building that, me, folks who've been on this show, we're building that roadmap. And so, yeah, I think my part is really, how do we think more critically about the folks who maybe don't know how to tap Zoom, or are used to that 2D interface. And I think something we've also thought is, do we bring more 2D elements into our app? I think we've been really enamored with the idea of everything happening 3D, everything being spatial. But at the same time, we want a flexible and approachable app that can be used in multiple environments. And sometimes spatial, sometimes space isn't there to engage with the AR experience. So what does that look like? So, yeah, that's really the thoughts that we've been thinking around that. Yeah.
Another friction that you've brought up related to developing augmented reality is the way in which it's currently connected to the big tech extractivist paradigm, the kind of like surveillance culture. And in that same interview, you said there's a hesitancy because this technology hasn't been built for us. White people have largely been the ones building these platforms. Unless you build your own complex website, people are putting these archives on Instagram or TikTok. Should we trust them with that precious community data? I don't think so. So talk to me a little bit about how you're kind of thinking about this friction with AR as a tool that can be liberatory and that can, as we've discussed, really foreground important and forgotten and erased histories, with the ways in which in the present it intersects with potentially problematic economic and social structures.
The goal of our work is to empower our communities and to create self-resiliency in our storytelling and historical preservation and education efforts. That is the space we're going to. What makes that hard, as you pointed out, is, the data is either on AWS or or Google Cloud. How do we combat the user who is very comfortable just staying on their Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat? Why would they want to go to another space when they have those tools already? But there's also a growing frustration with big tech in general and that data. There's been, I'm not even going to get into all of the issues that have come up around our Facebook's, Google's, Amazon's in terms of protection of our data. And so I'm looking for solutions. How can we have community own their data? Another issue with archives is that universities own a lot of the archives. And even though a historical figure's family might have a archival materials or artifacts in their basement, they a lot of times end up selling that to a university, and we're losing access to our culture.
Mm.
And a whole other side of this is I was about to say across the river, across the ocean, is where and here as well, is where ancient African artifacts are owned by museums in Belgium, France, New York, UK, where name one. And so I think this is a global issue, and how do we rectify with who the ownership of cultural artifacts, and as we get more into collecting community artifacts, I think that's where another tool technology can come in: 3D scanning. Like, we can 3D scan artifacts, have a space where people can engage with those artifacts digitally, but we don't even need to own it. You can keep ownership over this, but this can still help. This can still help supplement our collective memory and have a lot of uses outside of just sitting in one place. Um, so, but when I think about alternatives, that's where we need to get a little bit more creative. Um, Tech platforms are expensive to build and maintain. It needs a lot of money, and that's why big tech, a part of the why they have a monopoly over that. When we think about other alternatives to community-owned data, whether that's blockchain, peer-to-peer data storage, that's a solution we were looking into. But over the last few years, there's been a lot more skepticism brought into that blockchain space, maybe through people's perception of crypto, which isn't the only use for blockchain. But I wonder, is the user experience and the latency of using that situation, is that worth it? So I think that's something that we're exploring as well. A little further down the pipeline, because there's a lot of stuff we have to do to make that a reality, but that definitely is an interest. But in the interim, I feel like scanning artifacts, adding those to our archives so that people can access them, but not assuming ownership over them, is a first step.
I'm thinking of the example earlier this year, the collective Ludi brought the Rosetta Stone back to its original home in Egypt from the British Museum using 3D scanning technologies. And what was so powerful about that gesture was specifically putting it back. There's also this question when you're talking about archives of accessibility, and de facto, if you want somebody to be able to access that history who lives in Vancouver, then it becomes considerably more difficult to experience that. I'm putting air quotes in person. How are you thinking about the relationship between making 3D scanned objects accessible versus having an artistic statement regarding putting it back or bringing it roughly into its original location?
One, I'm speaking to Chidi this week, which is funny, the person who created Ludi. So definitely love the work that they're doing over there and interested in the intersections between our work. I think what we're thinking about, I think it's different work. I think we're thinking about education and storytelling. I think a conversation that I have often is, if we bring it back through augmented reality, what the physical problem is still there in terms of the ownership of that artifact. So what is the depth in which AR technology can create that sort of impact? I think the biggest impact within the space that we've found is storytelling and education. How do we create access to information so people can, one, imagine this new future, collectively build together, and express themselves? I think that's another journey down the line, is how can people contribute to our AR space based off of a historical prompt or art making, I think monument making. So we want to, I think from my view, it's really about education and storytelling, and that's where the 3D scanning of artifacts can help. I think an artistic gesture of bringing it back to the space, so augmented reality, is really strong, really powerful, really important. And then I guess the question I have is, what next? Like, where do we go from there, to capture that hype, that buzz, because it generated a lot of buzz and hype, that experience. Um, how can that support or bring eyes awareness to these issues and the many organizations that are already doing work to bring artifacts back to their original spaces? So I think there's a connection there that I think I'm always trying to build, with with our AR space, our virtual space, and the physical world and physical movements and changes that need to happen. So that's I guess where my mind goes, in terms of your question.
I feel like this is a good time to invite you to share a little bit about recent kinfolk projects. You've had a ton of recent success, Tribeca, MoMA, and I think describing what some of these projects have been so that people can get a sense, whether they're listening and just having this on audio, to understand how you're putting these ideas into practice.
So just to say, I mean, we've been doing this work since 2017. And at that beginning, it was prototypes. I was building them out, showing them to people, got a few grants, from New Museum and Eyebeam, to turn this into something sustainable. Um, and that was a lot of experiments with museums, a lot of internal experimentation. And then COVID hit. And then that was sort of a space where our visions were always to affect the public. How do we reimagine our public spaces? But then it was like, well, that's not an option right now. So how can we release something where people can engage with this wherever they are? So we did surface detection, AR, where people could bring the monuments that we've built, place them in their home, and learn about them. We were really, I think one thing about Kinfolk, everything is sort of a test for us to see and iterate. I think Kinfolk is always in development, always shifting. And we released in 2021 with Netflix. The app wasn't released with Netflix, but we released it in conjunction with 4 monuments that they commissioned, to go along with their docuseries, Amend the Fight for America, executive produced by Will Smith. And so that was when we released it, had 5 monuments in the app. And then we had Tribeca Film Festival of 2021 that year, where we did a walking tour around downtown Manhattan with the monuments that we already had in our app. But during that time, I guess what we figured out was clear to us that teachers were the ones using this. They had kids on Zoom. How can they teach this uncensored history in ways that resonated with the kids? That was our largest audience. Besides, when we go to an activation exhibition, that was what we were noticing. And so there started to be an emphasis on how do we bring educators into our space, because I teach computer science, but I'm not a formal educator, in a school. So we brought on a principal of a digital arts high school, Jasmine Mays, who helped us think about that aspect of things, how education fit into what we were doing, keeping the app public focused. And so I think when we reached the end of 2021, that's really where we were. We were a bunch of developers, artists, designers, researchers, and then we brought in the education arm with Jasmine that really started, this is this core of Kinfolk. We create these AR experiences, then we provide education around them. And so that's sort of the model that we've been trying to grow moving forward. And then in 2021, end of 2021, we got a large grant from the Mellon Foundation, which ballooned us to a point, like quadrupled, 5x the amount of money that we had been spending annually per year. So that was like, oh shoot, we can actually achieve the visions that we had. And so that's when we sort of launched a national tour where we wanted to go to 6 different cities, focus on the community building aspect of what we're doing, to build with community and really see where this could go. Because there were so many avenues. We could do it in schools. We could do it out of schools. We could focus on just museums and walking tours. We could make a consumer public art app. There was a lot of areas. So we wanted to go with the communities that were supporting these movements that I talked about before: reparations, monuments, critical race theory, and provide them sort of the app in its form and then iterate on it through that process. So from beginning of 2022 to now, I think we've just finished that tour. That's what we were doing. And throughout that process, we were working in New York, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Florence, Alabama, Atlanta, and Los Angeles. And so those are the cities that we were sort of trying to build within, trying to create community as outsiders, build trust. So that was a large driving force behind us over these last 2 years. And through that process of working, we got an invitation to to do an exhibition at the MoMA, which, I mean, I was like, what? Are you kidding me? Like, I thought it was spam email at first. I was like, this can't be right. And they came over to my house, walked them through the app, and then about 2 weeks later, we got an invitation to be a part of this show, which was called New York New Publics. It focused on 12 different artists and arts organizations and architecture firms that were changing the future landscape of public spaces in New York. We were the only digital inclusion in the show. I think in whatever space, if we're in the I didn't even consider myself an art architect or a designer. So I think to be included in that show was eye-opening in terms of how applicable AR is to the built environment, to the public realm, and how the ethos and mission of us to democratize these spaces reigns true throughout a lot of these spaces. And so for that show, they weren't requiring anything new. They were like, yeah, put some of your old stuff in there. But myself and my partner, Micah Milner, were like, oh, no, this is the MoMA. We're going to build a fire experience. And so how the process works for us is that do a lot of the art direction. We also have artists that we bring on to do art direction as well. But for this one, I did the art direction, and it starts with really intensive like research process to identify the histories we wanted to focus on. It was helpful that we were focusing on New York, and then two, what are the themes that we want to bring out through these, not just between one monument, between the group. What are the strings that we can tie between all of them? And then I don't really think about that visually at the beginning. And then it's like, all right, now how do we represent this visually based off the breadth of the research that's been done? And so we chose 3 different histories to focus on. One of them was the Young Lords, which was a revolutionary Afro-Latino group in the Harlem, South Bronx, as well as Lower Manhattan, who worked in tandem with the Black Panthers for liberation for their communities. They did things like free food, free breakfast programs, free education within churches. They took over. Did people takeovers of hospitals, and so it was all for advocacy for the fair treatment of their community. The next one was David Ruggles, who was one of the earliest abolitionists and modern day activists. He was a Black man from New York City who lived on 36 Lisbernard Street, right below Canal Street. And he was the leader of the biggest Black newspaper at the time, but also he was sort of like Batman. He would go on, like, if slavery was abolished in the North, but it was not abolished in the South, but people were still had slaves, enslaved people in New York City. So he would find those who were doing that, deem them illegal. But if people came across New York, across the northern lines, took enslaved Black folks down to the South, he would then go down to the South, capture them, and save them and bring them back. This happened on boats. It happened on trains. So he was really a Batman. I was like, a video game should be made of David Ruggles, but that's for another time. And the last one was Seneca Village, which was a free Black community that existed in Central Park, where Central Park exists now. And around the early 1800s to 1850s, Seneca Village existed. Central Park didn't exist till late 1850s, early 1860s. And it existed between 82nd and 86th Street, Central Park West, around there. And in order to build New York City and Central Park, which is the penultimate example of public space, they destroyed that community, fully grazed it to the ground, built Central Park over it. And so when we're talking about public spaces, the question I'm trying to pose is, what does public space mean and to who? There are spaces where we are not welcome and we were actively erased from and tied to gentrification today. Like, who are we building these spaces for? Like, let's assess that. And so that was sort of the content conceptual side of it. And then my partner, Micah Milner, who's the brains behind the 3D art, him and David Dominguez were the main builders of this. And so we was a long back and forth collaboration in terms of how we'd visually represent them. With Seneca Village, we did things called portals, which are definitely we had trees and there were holes within the trees. And if you go up to those holes, it's basically a 3D world that's housed inside of it. So we used that to build what Seneca Village would have looked like, since there's no visual record of what anyone who lived in Seneca Village looked like besides a few people. And so you can't walk into the portals, but you could see them. And like, if you move around, you can see it. It's a full 180. So that's the example we did for that. And we did that for the Young Lords. And then it's like sort of the exhibition design is the last part of that. So we wanted to, a lot of times we do empty pedestals. But I think, first off, I think nature is an important part of my life. And so the connection between nature and technology is a very interesting space for Kinfolk through my artistic practice in general. And so we wanted to bring that to life and not just put an empty white pedestal. So we found these cutouts, these tree trunks that were like 300 years old, that were red maple tree trunks that existed, like the indigenous tree to Central Park, or that area was red maple. And so we found trees that were dying, sustainably sourced, cut them out and placed them in the MoMA, 3 of them. And then we had iPads. Sorry, when you got the phone, you download the app, you could just scan it. Those were the image targets. There were so many unique circles in the tree that it was a great pattern for image recognition. So that was like blowing people's mind. Like, oh, you just pointed at it, it just comes up. And so that was really cool, a really proud moment for us. And then we had 3 iPads stationed, so that museum goers could take the iPads off, and we actually like 3D scan the entire space, and place the monuments on there. So with the iPads, people didn't need to scan anything. The monuments were already placed. So it was 24/7 activation of these monuments, with no docents, which was a large challenge. We had to build a back-end program that people could go scan each pedestal in the morning, place them, and then throughout the day it would be fine. I think what we didn't expect is the amount of people that would drop the iPad. They would drop the iPad, which would, of course, mess up the tracking. And
Among
they
other
would
things.
also, among other things. And then if they didn't place it, some people would place it pointing down at the ground. And like, it's equated to like a person seeing, like, those are the eyes. So if the eyes are pointed at the ground, like, it's not going to remember where things go when you bring it back up. We had a good regression, sort of a replacement sort of automatic algorithm where people pointed it would replace it, but sometimes it was a little bit wobbly. Like, sometimes the tree was pointed to the side after someone dropped it. So I think those are the pitfalls of what we were working through. But it was a tall order, but it was extremely, I mean, we got thousands of people every day looking at our piece for 6 months. Like, our user numbers skyrocketed, and just the amount of sheer impressions through the iPads was through the roof. And so it's been, I think this really jump started us, I would say, in terms of like brand recognition and people knowing about Kinfolk. So it was it was an amazing experience, being able to activate at the MoMA and being able to, hey, this is my work, go see it, it's right there. So that was cool.
Yeah, I mean, did anybody give, was there a mechanism for people to give feedback? Like, I'm curious what you heard from the public, particularly when you think about the fact that most XR experiences are encountered by people who intended to go have those VR or AR experiences and probably have a base level of literacy. But what you're talking about is a truly public engagement. And so I can imagine there was a ton of new feedback you were hearing.
Yeah, I mean, Momo is definitely different from Tribeca. I'll tell you that, because again, people come to those spaces to engage. This was much different. Um, there was no mechanism for feedback, which is something that I think going back, that was probably what we should have done. What we did do is we had people observing.
Mm.
So we had folks, graduate researchers come in, track people's movements to see, did they go from A, B to C? Did they look at the wall works to help us plan for upcoming exhibitions? But I think the main feedback was really around the mission, how powerful it was. People get a lot of, when they engage with kinfolk, they get a lot of ideas around what AR could do. Like, oh, you should do this. People become product designers in a second once they touch an AR app, which is what I love about it. There's endless possibilities for folks. But I think a lot of it is like, goes back to a point I make, is like technology is the vessel, like it's not the highlight. Like it's the mechanism in which we can create accessibility and interactivity around these stories. But a lot of the comments were on the histories that people were like, oh, I've never heard of David Ruggles. What am I doing? And I'm like, well, be easy on yourself. Like I didn't know, it took me a while to know David Ruggles too. But it's like people thinking about monuments critically, people thinking about the absence of their spaces. I think that's something people take for granted. It's like, what is missing from my space? What are the stories that aren't being told? Seneca Village is a big one for people because, everyone and their mom loves Central Park. But to think about the displacement that came as a result of it, I think is really eye-opening for people. So I think our goal is to have it's not possible, have the technology seem invisible and really have you immersed in the experience and the stories and the content. When people are watching movies, they're not like, oh man, this TV is amazing. Like this screen is great. It's like they're focused on what they're receiving. And a lot of the times I think AR apps, ours at times too, has been like the bugs get in the way, the experience gets in the way of truly like people are thinking about the mechanism a lot. And it's like the mechanism is great, but how can we make that a little bit more seamless so that people can focus on the messages that we're trying to send? So that was a lot of the feedback. A lot of feedback was positive around being able to the mission of what we're doing. Especially of one of the few Black, brown, or people of color within this exhibition. There's another one, Oleakun Jafus, who creates these Afrofuturistic visions of the future of New York and around the world. I think he just recently won the Venice Architectural Biennale, but he was the other person of one of the other people of color in the exhibit who we were right next to, and he had 3D modeled some of his pieces, which I thought was really cool as well. He made like food. He turned like different household and cultural items into food, which I thought was really great. He had like a banh mi bus. I don't know. I'm getting too into it, but I think it was people thinking about what is not being told. Was the biggest feedback that we got. I mean, we also got feedback on the exhibition itself. I think it was a tall order to do a 24, or at least all day activation with very little docents, because of the unpredictability of the technology. It still is emerging. Sometimes it wouldn't work for people, but I'm like, yeah, that's because someone just dropped it. So I think next time it's like, all right, because we were really big on having people move around. Like these are 360 experiences. So if we're in a museum space, how can we have them move around? We asked like, hey, can we just untether the iPad and just have people move it around? But stealing the iPad was a big worry for them. And so that's why we came up with a cord that could be extended and you could walk around, which wasn't the most visually appealing solution. So maybe next time we'll just have the iPad stuck there pointing at a certain angle. And if you want to experience the full spatial thing, just download on your phone. There's a QR code right there. Because I think we had to fix the stand twice. Build a whole new stand like a quarter way through the exhibit, because what we had originally didn't really work. So I think there's definitely thinking about how does AR exist within these museum spaces, which aren't maybe used to upholding this technology. Like Tribeca was smooth. Like they have docents, they have backup iPads. They have people charging them at night. They have things taken care of. Whereas a museum space is like, all right, you do your thing. We'll be here. We're used to sculptures existing that don't need upkeep. This is a lot for us.
Mm.
So I think that's if we want to get AR back into the more of this mainstream, especially in the museum space, I think we'll have to think of still be creative around our solutions around exhibitions.
But that's what makes the work you're doing doubly important is we have to we have to learn these lessons the hard way. Like we're not going to get to the point where we have seamless integrations until we learn them the hard way. And so it sounds like in addition to important historical work, you are also kind of starting to crack the code on at least how to think about these exhibitions in the future to make them, ever so slightly more seamless.
Yeah, that was like that hadn't dawned on me, but then I spoke to Anna Brzezinka of Tribeca, and she was like, I brought it to the exhibit. We talked after. She's like, you're setting the stage for how AR is going to be exhibited. You're doing that groundwork, and I was like, oh shoot, yeah, that is right. And I mean, I'm down to be a guinea pig. I think I like failing, and I like experimentation, and I think that's what you need to be in this space. You have to be okay with failing, trying new things. And so, yeah, I think that is important. I think we're trying to document these things. Maybe finding a way to share them out with the community is another angle that we could take moving forward. Because, yeah, they're only going to increase. This was one of the first AR exhibitions in the MoMA, if not the first. And so, yeah, I think we did get a lot of great learnings that I think could be shared.
Amazing. So outside of the exhibition design aspects, there's also a lot of complications I assume, in determining among a small number of exhibition opportunities, which histories to foreground. What are some of the processes that you've engaged? Are you working with consultants? Are you working with, you referenced bringing on a principal, an educator? How are you thinking about what histories you're foregrounding?
So I think it depends on the space. I think with this national tour, the focus was letting community decide. So we would do surveys. That was digital, social media, canvassing for in-person surveys, to get a list of nominations from communities. When we go to like tenting, we're tabling at events, we'd have like surveys people could take to put in their nomination for their community. And that's a list that we have grown right now to like 150
Mm.
plus. That leads us to figure out, hey, what do we want to do? If we're working closely with artists, which we have, like we'll give them that list for them to look through, so that they can ascertain what is important. I think there is a interesting like intersection between like getting communities to choose what they want to input, but then having an artist come in who is like, I want to do this different thing. So that's something we have to intentionally build out so that artists are foregrounding and prioritizing the community's input. And then I think we also have different monuments that we build for education, that can be used within classrooms that are maybe tailored to the AP African American Literature course, or courses that have been, or AP courses that have been banned, like in Florida. A lot of those books that have been banned, those histories we brought onto our list so that those could be built out over time. I think one thing to preface is that I think this is a long-term thing. It's not like we're building X amount and we're done. I think we're trying to build a system for continually building these AR experiences. And I think that's been a challenge when I think a certain exhibition might want us to focus on a certain thing when we're building other monuments for other areas. So that's definitely been a juggling act, and we're still working through the best way to put that process forward. But the main priority is how do we collect community input, spread that input to artists, and in the future have a way that communities can make their own monuments and add those into the experience. But I think with Tribeca and exhibition, we displayed monuments that we'd already built
Mm.
with communities that we were already working on. So those were 3 monuments within New York, which I'll get into, that celebrated Black enclaves. And those were existing partnerships that we had already made. And we just highlighted the storytelling aspects with that exhibition a little bit further than we normally would on our monuments that are available in the app. So it's definitely a push and pull. And there's not there's not so many exhibitions that we're creating for. So it's like, what are we creating in between those exhibitions to achieve our mission of preserving this history? So I think moving forward, we're trying to have even more intentional community engagement process. We've done things like selection committees, where we have a selection committee of historians and consultants and artists, filmmakers come in and do the research themselves and add those into our buckets.
Mm.
Like, for example, for the MoMA, I just did research myself and came to a conclusion as an artist of what is the best thing to focus on. So there's a multiple ways in which we do it depending on the situation. But our baseline is always to find ways to empower communities to have a voice and participate in the process, whether that's just regular, like the people folks in the community or local artists. That's a big thing for us.
It definitely seems like something that's complicated, but you're also bringing this ethos that comes with working in emerging tech of adapting as you're seeing what works and what best serves the community.
Yes. No, that's a big thing. It's like Kinfolk is always a work in progress. And we believe that, we know, but also the community knows best in terms of what they use, especially if we're able to run them through the process of thinking about product design, of user testing the app, of gathering feedback and thinking critically about their experience. So, that's a big thing, and it's a very experimental space, and it's a lot of failing and learning and doing again. So I think the last 2 years, we're still in that process of learning and sharpening. We are community first, but I think there's still ways that we can become better at that. And I think that's something that we've learned over time. The structure around these processes and the operational aspect of them is almost, if not more important, to being successful in this mission as well, especially when you're gathering so many spaces. So I think that's something that we've realized as well, is that we need more emphasis on the operational excellence of Kinfolk to make sure that all these voices are heard and properly integrated into the app.
Mm. And why do you see AR as the medium to share this art and express these stories? Like a filmmaker, you referenced you have filmmaker parents. A filmmaker might look at what you're doing and say, well, there are other ways you could tell these stories that are, have tried and trusty best practices that would make things considerably easier, and you wouldn't necessarily have to take this more experimental approach. But you've not only taken this experimental approach, but you've been running with it for coming up on 7 years now. So why?
Maybe because I'm a crazy man, but maybe it's also because I guess I'm seeing where things are going. I'm seeing how people are engaging with technology. I think me and my team have been pretty forward thinking about where spatial computing is heading and how that's being integrated into our lives. There's been a lot of things that we thought were happening that really didn't pan out as of yet. And so, I think that's a question I'm still asking myself. Is AR the best way to do this? My hypothesis is still yes, but there's still a lot of things to figure out and a lot of things to make that the best medium. I think there's something easy about a film to engage with. People understand that. But the accessibility of a film, it's like you watch it in certain spaces. It's at your home. You can watch on TV. You can go to a theater. I guess you could watch it on your phone walking through. But I think the device that we believe in is the phone, I think, as of right now. How that operates with, I think AR is the most artistic and interactive, participatory medium. I think that goes back to our ethos of empowering communities to be involved in this process. AR as a output is very participatory. You can bring different sorts of media into the space. People can get an experience. And I think being an active learner, um, it's just a much more memorable thing than having to take in reading or watching something on a 2D screen. And that's not to say we have implemented video in our app. I mean, there's uses for all different kinds of media. I think the phone and a XR enabled platform, I think really gets to the heart of the problem that we're trying to solve. And the location based aspect is just the cherry on top. That's a whole new frontier of being able to activate spaces remotely. We partner with Niantic and put Lightship into our app, and like now you can, if we wanted to, we could go on my computer, drop Toussaint Louverture Monument and Eiffel Tower, release the app without even going there, and it exists. And so that power to take over our spaces, that's just not possible with other mediums. I think we can go back to guerrilla like physical tactics, like putting posters, doing things of that nature, but AR is such a beautiful medium to take over space, but also the creation of those materials is also shareable on so many different platforms. And so I think you can take AR experience and take that 3D model, put it on a website so people could spin it around with their mouse. So if we build for the most innovative aspect, we can then trickle it down to more accessible mediums as well. So I think, again, the phone is the technology that I think that we really believe in. It's going to take a while, in my mind, for people to transition to glasses. And there will be some staunch non-glasses folks who are like, I'm never putting that on my head. And especially when the digital divide is so large within my communities, the phone is one of the more accessible pieces of technology that we have. More people have a smartphone than a computer or a headset or anything like that. So people are always like, oh, you were talking about accessibility, but you're building an AR. How is that accessible? But it is the most accessible form of XR. One of the most accessible forms, but I also think that there's a part of bringing people to the future with you and making them believe that this is not the future, this is low-key now, that I think is really empowering. So yeah, it's about building the future we want, and this is the direction that we're headed. The phone is going to be on top for a long time. So that's what we're committed to. If there was some information that came out in a few years that AR is not the way to go, I think we would try to rethink things and see. I think we're flexible to technologies. I think nothing has trumped AR at this point in terms of participation, access, and ability to activate sites.
Yeah,
but I think it's a part of the whole thing. I think we've realized that there needs to be other structures built around the AR that can make it even more accessible. So that's something that's been on my mind as well.
Say more about that.
So, for example, like if you play some, like the only way you can really access like the historical archival content is by placing a monument and clicking on it. And then you access that information. But some people, especially when we're thinking about classrooms or learning environments, maybe they just want to access the history. Maybe they don't want to go through maybe they don't want to experience a monument at this moment in time. Are we just not bringing those people into the fold in terms of using Kinfolk? That's been a question. And if we want ease of access to information, what are the ways that we can build that in? So maybe you can go to a different spot of the app to engage with information in certain ways. This is still things we're thinking about. But yeah, I think it goes back to what I said in the beginning of like, does everything have to be spatial? I think as XR purists, a lot of times we're like, yeah, we should make everything spatial, engage with information spatially. Um, but sometimes we need to leave bits and pieces for people who aren't in this future to really anchor on and ground themselves in, so they don't feel like they're lost when in AR. Sometimes people get like, oh no, I don't know what to do. This app, I don't know, and that's what sometimes a lot of the sentiment from new users. And so, what is our focus? Are we focusing on onboarding new users who might not be so XR ready? That needs to be something that we think about. Like maybe don't jump them right into the camera. So there's, yeah, accessibility is a big portion of this.
Mm. Yeah, it seems like just just like how we still read books and engage with posters, certain best practices from a media standpoint and technology in the broadest sense of the word persist for a reason. And so
Yes.
it sounds like you're kind of grappling with how do we balance these new elements we're throwing at people and all the sort of questions and chaos that come with doing that with other ways to access the concepts and the ideas that you're activating to where maybe they don't necessarily need to start with the most high end expression. They can start in a more familiar place and progress.
Yeah, no, that's really big for us. I think technology is again the vessel, and we don't want it to get too in the way of of people accessing what we want them to. We had a longer onboarding in the beginning of Kinfolk, and that walked you through each part of the app. Um, but we realized people don't really read either. And so that was one thing. Like maybe we just have a shorter onboarding, and people learn, and we'll have tooltips that can pop up, but that's not a barrier to the experience. Um, so I mean, yeah, we really are thinking about the easiest ways to get this content to people, but also that are the most artistic, interactive, and engaging. And so these technologies work together. It's not one or the other. There's time and space for both of them, which is why I think AR is a great medium because it can bring them all together. You can watch a video in AR space. You can point your camera at a image, and that image will start activating and coming to life. There's so many ways. It's a Swiss Army knife of media. So we really want to harness that potential, but also make it accessible and comfortable for people.
Mm. Which gets at some of your misgivings about headset-based AR as a mass platform, which I wanted to invite more commentary from you about. Obviously, the Apple Vision Pro made a lot of headlines this year and is trickling its way into the world. How are you thinking about developing for the Vision Pro as an individual artist or your work at Kinfolk? Um, and do you have a timeline in mind, or will there be a sort of social sentiment regarding the digital divide you referenced, where you feel like it's time for us to incorporate that? Like, I'm just wanting to open up to your thoughts on where headsets and glasses do fit in, if at all.
Yeah, I mean, we are thinking about the Vision Pro. We're talking to folks at Apple about building for it. That's definitely a conversation. I think it's about at that point it's R&D though for us. It's like what does this offer? We'll throw a few little resources at it to experiment and build a prototype. I think the opportunities for that, I mean, it's very expensive, just first and foremost. But beyond that, I do think it's a powerful device. Very singular device, I would say. Like if I wanted to watch a movie, like me watching a movie with my fiance, is that $7,000 now for us to get two of those headsets in our living room, which is what they were putting forth in that ad. I wonder what the social capabilities are and what they'll build out in that moving forward. But first off, it would make exhibitions a lot more interesting. For example, at Tribeca, like we had people holding an iPad for 10 to 15 minutes. And that is a lot of time. Your muscles started to get a workout. So it was like a headset would be a great tool to activate our space, to activate that space. So it would make institutional activations, I think, more interesting. in terms of like higher educational institutions, high schools. Um, and that's also interesting given that the schools have the money to pay for it, which also like limits what the demographics that are engaging with these Vision Pros are. But I think it could be helpful in those settings. We've thrown around ideas around what an activation of kinfolk could look like, a companion to learn about history in your living room, immersing you in these environments. I'm sure these are things a bunch of people have thought about. It's not something that we're focused on building for, I will say. I think there's a time and space where it can be used, but since our ethos and our goal and our mission is to make this technology accessible for all, it's hard to see where the Vision Pro fits into that on a larger scale. Um, 10 years from now, when Apple releases their AR glasses or something, I think that's something that maybe is a little bit more attractive. But that's not to say we're not building for it. I mean, we love XR, we love this stuff, and we want to explore the opportunities that are available. Um, like for walking tours, I think a big focus of ours is how do we get on historical walking tours, partnerships with like national parks, partnerships with museums, botanical gardens. I think there's been demand for AR in those spaces that we found, and with those institutions, the Apple headset Pro could come into play. Um, but VR tools are a big creation tool for us. Like we create a lot of our artwork in Quill, which was open sourced by Meta. Um, but that I think, especially with artists who are coming to this like 2D artists, them being able to intuitively paint and sculpt spatially, I think that clicks way faster than going to Blender, Maya, or Unity and creating through those means. That takes a more trained computer science 3D design mind. But if you come into a space with the VR headset, you have a palette, a paintbrush, and you can go crazy and really hone that tool over time. And I wonder the creation possibilities. I think a large goal for us is to have the community that we're building be able to create and add to kinfolk. We don't want to be the only ones like creating these monuments or creating these experiences. How can we have more user or community centered, community built content that we can put onto our app? And I wonder where headsets fit into that, because they do make it a little bit easier to create. And especially with students, we want students to be able to create, because there are 3D design courses that are being implemented across nationally. And so how can we imbue our mission and our values and our focus into these 3D art courses and 3D modeling and 3D design courses that are happening at the high school level? And I wonder if headsets have a place. We do workshops where we bring a headset and have people craft what a monument is, and we have Micah and the headset building the monument that they want together, and they can see it on the screen. So that's, I think, a large focus. I wonder if headsets play a role in that. But bottom line, headsets aren't really our focus, but we are toying around with them.
Got it. You referenced earlier that you like being a guinea pig. One very obvious way that I've seen this play out from afar in your life that we haven't talked about is American Promise. Could you share a little bit about that experience being the subject of an ongoing documentary throughout your youth?
Yeah, American Promise was a documentary made by my parents um, that followed me from kindergarten to 12th grade graduation. I'm going to a predominantly white upper class private school on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. It followed me and my best friend Shayon Summers as we went through those as black men, black boys. Um, and I think, I mean, first off, try like being a teenager or being a kid with your parents filming that. I mean, that's a whole different experience. I would try to rebel from the filming of of these things, especially when it got towards high school, because that's kids rebel against their parents. But that was one aspect. But the other aspect was, I mean, I was getting asked questions about my race in relationship to other people. And when I was 5 years old,
Mm.
talking about the fact that I feel poor, and people in my class are asking me, am I rich or am I poor? At me feeling othered, me wanting to be white when I'm 6 years old because I don't feel like the people in my classroom. And so that again contributes to the critical thinking on my aspect of why I do the work that I do. Um, and the impact. I think I got to saw the impact of the media. I was traveling the country after the media, went to Sundance Film Festival, other New York Film Festival, but more importantly, went to different high schools and middle schools across the country to speak to kids who were going through the same experience that I was. And that imprinted on my brain just the impact of the media can have. Like, you're reaching people, the stories you're telling are real, and it it helps build a community of people who don't feel alone, even though they might feel alone. And so I think that's something that, so I often say is like, oh, I'm the evolution of my parents' work because now I'm doing it interactively, which they made a VR documentary called Changing Same. But that was after I introduced them to VR AR. So I need to take a little bit of credit for that one. AR, this medium, is a new evolution of storytelling. And I think my experience, my lived experience going through a documentary, having filmmaker parents, I think really helps me find the right stories and helps imbue storytelling more into the AR medium. I think there could be more opportunities for storytelling. I think a lot of it is done a lot of looping animations, and I think there could be room for scenes within AR that we're trying to build out that have more narrative-based stories. So I think we're trying to, yeah, I think that's the experience that I bring into the space, which I think is really helpful. Um, but it was a transformative period, and made a lot of friends along the way who are helping me push this forward now. So that's been helpful.
Now we enter the recurring questions lightning round portion of the show. So the first question is, what is one resource you recommend for making better sense of reality?
I tried to find an interesting answer to this question, but the answer is books. The answer is information. I think if you're reading books, and thinking critically about and reading critical texts, texts about the world, fiction or nonfiction, I think you're putting yourself way ahead of a lot of other people, in terms of processing reality and where we are. I think bringing in diverse perspectives, is super important, to your own journey. I think we could all benefit from more perspective and more empathy and more understanding of others' areas and others, where other people are coming from. And I think books, whether you just got to go to the download ebooks and read on your iPhone, like, it does not need to be a physical book. Um, but gathering that information, I mean, that's the key to understanding reality a little bit more. Even if you want to get really literal and read a book on quantum physics and figure out what time and space are really, I think I've done that. So I think that's what that's the only answer that came to my mind for that, is like intentionally engaging with information specifically that's not in your medium. I think that's a big part of the success of Kinfolk, is bringing diverse and intersectional voices together. Um, all XR enthusiasts, a team of XR, solely XR purists, I think might not come to the best solution. Same way as a team of finance bros might not come to the best solution. I think the insulation of our circles, is not producing the creativity that we need. And so, in my art direction background, I'm really trying to find as many disparate and different sources, that the beauty of human and reality is bringing these together, to create something unique and creative. So I definitely think immersing yourself in different kinds of information, is super, super pivotal, to making a better sense of reality.
Shout out books.
Shout out books. Shout out books.
Shout out books. I will say I love that answer. And for me, the additional benefit that I find, I don't know if you feel this way, is as I'm reading, my brain, my subconscious is kind of
Is
reassembling
going.
ideas. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a beautiful thing. That's really a beautiful thing. Um, yeah, I mean, if a lot of times people say like, "Oh, if you're an artist and doing work, or you're a creative problem solver, the answers come when you're doing something else instead of like maybe focusing on that issue, taking a break, taking a walk, reading a book. I mean, your mind is constantly at work. And so exposing your mind to different ideas, it will morph itself, just like you said. That was a beautiful way to put it.
Mm. What is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
I think one, their own curiosity. I think there is an imaginative aspect to a child, which I think we should find a way to keep that. I think that's what makes the most innovative solutions. How can we be curious? And then step two is, I think, getting outside of ourselves. I think I wish people pay more attention to things outside of themselves, and also contemplated an experience of nature and the world around us. I mean, like, we are very small in the grand scheme of space and time, and so I think there's a sense of like connecting with that I think would bring one, more a better understanding of reality, but two, better connection with each other. I think really, how do we view ourselves as a collective? I think is super vital to uh, s- the betterment of society. And besides going out and connecting with people, I think going out and connect with nature, looking at the stars, those are things for me that show me that we are in the same game here. And so I wish people paid more attention to our spatial surroundings, our environment, because that's honestly what pushes me into AR, is also allowing people to connect through technology with their environment. There's so many possibilities beyond kinfolk in terms of leveraging this technology to activate nature space.
Mm.
Um, that would really transform our curiosity, transform our imaginations. So yeah, that's my answer. I think nature. Yeah, I think that's what I wish people paid more attention to, is nature.
Love it. And the final question, what is one time your reality or sense of reality was disrupted?
I guess going back to the nature of looking at the stars, I think that disrupts. I think sometimes the disrupts the tunnel vision that I feel like sometimes I'm susceptible to in life, of focusing on work, focusing on career path, and I think that really that helps me see the better whole. And I think my reality was disrupted for the better. And I think whether that's through shrooms or psychedelics, I think that has been something that has helped me get that perspective. Um, there's a bunch of art pieces and painters that I've experienced that have really helped disrupt my understanding of reality, whether that's a Jack Whitten, who's a black painter who, I mean, the way he visualizes these intense concepts through abstraction, speaks about historical figures, but speaks about deaths of people like Amadou Diallo and George Floyd through very just beautiful ways that really disrupts my reality of what art can be. But I think, to answer the question more succinctly, I've experienced not a lot of burnout, but there was one time where, after working through a bunch of like the MoMA, like day in, day out, we were in the MoMA for like a month straight, testing, then going to events, and then doing Tribeca. I mean, there's a point where my reality was disrupted to, like, that's not all that's important in life. Like, I'm a human being with physical needs, nutrition, health, self-care. And I think when I've gotten I'm a hard worker that tends to get focused on work. And I think I'm still to this day trying to figure out how can I implement a bet like self-care? Like we're here for a good time, not a long time. And so I think it's important to find that balance. And my reality is disrupted when I realized that there was no balance, and
Mm.
there was not a lot of balance in my life when I was just working, and especially as leader of organization, that trickles down into everybody working. Um, and so there was a point where it definitely my bubble burst to be like, this can't be the way forward. And there's people who are I'm working with that also have needs that need to be met, that have lives um, that are human beings. And so I think starting a journey of intentional self care, uh, was something that I'm still trying to do. Haven't figured it out yet. But I would say a moment when I burned out, was super tired, and couldn't go anymore for a little bit was when I realized my reality burst. Like, yo, you need to switch up,
Mm.
switch something up.
Mm.
Because the work is important, but if the work's important, you got to take care of yourself so that that work is being done to its best level. So, that's probably I think that's where my reality was disrupted.
Mm. Yeah, startups in general are, to put it mildly, anxiety inducing. Like being a founder is already difficult. But what I've observed is being a founder of a startup that's in an emerging space where there aren't clear best practices or um, guidebooks amplifies that chaos by an exponent. And then when you're hitting these big career milestones that people aspire to, I'm sure, you as a young person observing what you were doing at that time would have had their mind blown. um, I can see how all of that coalesces into um, just an insatiable drive for work, and I can see how that would lead to maybe discounting sleep and proper meals and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's not sustainable. We talk about sustainability. I think there's a point where you reach it, maybe, but um, it's also important to take care of yourself along that journey. And I think everything you stated is correct. And then also add the fact that we're a nonprofit as well. Um, that's something that we haven't talked about here, but that definitely adds to it, in terms of there's ways that you're expected to operate as a nonprofit, um, that you don't operate as a for-profit, but there's not too the most amount of examples of technology nonprofits, and so we're sort of caught in between a bind, where sustainability, I think, is a larger question that we are constantly trying to answer, and that does induce anxieties. There are some close moments, where funding comes down to the wire. And so it's definitely anxiety inducing. Um, but I think as long as you're trying to take care of yourself, um, it'll you can make it work. But the emerging space, I totally resonate with you on that. There's no playbook, and there are downsides to being a guinea pig. Like, even though I proudly said I was a guinea pig up front, like there are definitely downsides that myself and my team are experiencing. So, but that's all par for the course in terms of like building this new future. So, we're here for it.
I'd love to hear from you more on the tech nonprofit bit that you brought up, because as you said, I don't there are not a ton of reference points for that type of organization.
Yeah. And now the big reference point is OpenAI. Even though, I mean, rich people starting a nonprofit is a different space than, someone with no money starting a nonprofit. But, yeah, I mean, I think the goal was always to build for my community, build for Black, Brown, queer, and underrepresented folks. Um, I felt like a lot of the issues with tech is that it's so focused on profit extraction, advertising, that something like Kinfolk needs to exist. Um, we need a more non-profit based platform that's built to increase impact and well-being within our communities, that's protecting our data. But the world wasn't built to, I guess, the story I'm telling myself and experiencing is that the world isn't built to prioritize human well-being through business. And so it's been a roller coaster trying to figure out what are the ways that we can be sustainable. And to this point, it's been all through grants. But grants come with donors, intent, donor expectations, um, nonprofit foundations. It's which they're evolving and becoming more equitable. But there are situations where they're not covering overhead or they're not covering administrative fees. Like it's project to project, and that can create instability, especially when you're a tech nonprofit, which needs tech talent, and that tech talent can go somewhere else if they want to and get a higher salary. I'm very thankful. That sounds bad. I'm lucky to be in a position where we can't trust our big tech companies to keep us on for a long time because of layoffs. I think that's something that's happening that makes folks want to go more towards a smaller company. But then we're competing against startup salaries. So what I will say is that this nonprofit space has provided us the capability and space for experimentation. With if we had gone for profit in the beginning, we would have been subject to making revenue, making investors' money back, being drawn away from our mission, which some people call mission creep. And the app would have been a lot different. But with this nonprofit space, it's not like the output of the product necessarily fully retains that funding. There's a whole fundraising department, writing grants, making relationships. That's what keeps it going. So there's been a real flexibility to build what we want to build and experiment with that. And I don't think we'd be here today if we were for profit in 2017. But I think our ability to be a nonprofit and excel in nonprofit fundraising has brought us to a space to where we are today. And it's allowed us to like, okay, we can definitely focus now after we've got a lot of learnings. But it's been the most sustainable for us so far. And I think one thing we are thinking about in the future is like, how can we get more revenue that's maybe like a nonprofit can earn revenue as long as it's associated with its mission. So how can we get partners that are aligned, that are helping us towards our mission, come on board and build with us? So how do we get schools involved? So there's a lot of different outlets. And I think that's also where the conversation around bringing more recognizable elements of technology that maybe aren't just AR, I think that will help with that aspect as well. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot we're thinking about, something we haven't really figured out. We've been very fortunate to have great funders to support us to this point and moving forward. But it's a tricky space to be in, which is also another frontier that we're sort of experimenting with, is the business aspect of tech nonprofits.
Well, we have covered a ton of different stuff related to augmented reality and business structures and everything in between. But I wanted to open up to you to see if there was anything else, any other big ideas about any of the above, especially as we're sitting here at the end of 2023, opening into a new year. Are there any, big ideas, predictions, thoughts to share about the state of the medium or anything else?
Geolocation is going to be a lot. I think geolocation is going to grow. And I think that's a lot of our focus, is how can we use what we've built. Like we released the location-based version of our app this past November. And that we released it with 4 artists in New York City. We did a exhibition. Our signature series, we worked with artists like Hank Willis Thomas, Derek Adams, Tourmaline, and Pamela Council to really reimagine what this augmented layer can be. And I think moving forward, we're trying to figure out, we have like 40 plus monuments in our archive right now, and how can we tag those to spaces? How can we bring this location-based aspect to life, which is really exciting for us. We've there's a lot more work on the horizon, and I think geolocation is going to be a big part of that. And I think there's going to be more exhibitions to come. We have an exhibition with Wangechi Mutu, who is an artist from Kenya, that we're going to be doing an AR piece in New Orleans come April. So that's another aspect, another exhibition that's coming up. And so we're going to continue to harness the power of this technology, this medium. And yeah, and that's really all I had to say, is just to plug the location, because that's something that it's going to take a collective to bring to life. Pokemon Go has been really successful, but beyond that, I'm wondering where the other geolocation successes have come. There was a Gorillas AR exhibit, which was really nice and immersive. But I guess I'm anticipating a lot more geolocation experiences to break through the zeitgeist in the coming years.
All right. Love to hear that. Idris, thank you for being on Urgent Futures. It's been a super illuminating conversation.
Thank you very much for having me.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.